Hello veterans, and welcome back to C4. Again, I'm your host. My name is Rick Seaman, and today the subject is PTSD. With me today are two experts on the subject. To my right, to your left, is Shad Meshad. Shad is the founder of the Vet Center programs for the VA. Shad is also the founder of the National Veterans Foundation. And Shad has been working with PTSD since the word began, I would say. Also, on my left, on your right, I have Dr. Bridget Cantrell. She is a counselor and therapist from Washington State, and she's down here in our area this month. She's on a workshop tour with the military.
That's correct, yes.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Great to have you folks here. As I like to do in most cases, I like to give us a little background on our subjects. PTSD. Shad, you were around when the word was invented, or if that's a proper term.
Well, I was one of the pioneers. There were several of us, but we didn't know it as PTSD. We knew it was different. It wasn't schizophrenia. It wasn't psychosis. It wasn't character disorder, personality disorder. We knew that there were changes that occurred in life-death situations, which are in combat. And there were many of us giving it different names in the early 70s. Actually, in 1970, Dr. Haim Shatten gave it the name post-Vietnam syndrome. Actually, it wasn't a syndrome, but he was using that sort of as a figure of speech of saying it's different than this or that. And so from that, for many years, everybody says, do you have PVS? Post-Vietnam syndrome. That was the big word all through the 70s. It was like, well, what is syndrome? Syndrome, I mean, it really has no meaning. It's just sort of a generic concept that there's there's something interactive, there's something that's here. And so many of us, from Dr. Robert Lifton, Haim Shatten, particularly Dr. Charles Figley, who also was a combat Marine vet in the mid-60s who came back and whatever, and he did his research and started looking over the 20th century, from World War I. There was a lot of history written there, and obviously World War II and Korea and in Vietnam, and said that this is sort of a delayed stress reaction. It's, we sort of freeze dry trauma, because if you're ever in a catastrophic event, you usually, just try to get through it. You don't sit and think about it, because usually they happen pretty fast. Usually, not all the times. Mm-hmm. And so the brain has this function where it just sort of freezes everything and just survives whatever's going on. It's later, when the person is finally away from danger, that things start happening. There's sort of this meltdown, and all of a sudden these stress reactions, weird behavior occurs when there's really nothing catastrophic happening. We called it delayed stress. In fact, the first book was written by Figley in 78 called Delayed Stress Reactions Amongst Vietnam Veterans. And that was a very significant book. Yeah. And because of the time Jimmy Carter was in, and he was very sensitive to a lot of the work, including mine, in the VA at the time. And with the fact that, Alan Cranston had been pushing so hard for a Vietnam vet readjustment bill, but no one knew what's readjustment, what's syndrome. Mm-hmm. And I had this program in Los Angeles in the Vietnam Veterans Resocialization Unit, and I was dealing with this post-Vietnam syndrome, running my rap groups, dealing with it, just didn't have a definition, couldn't file a claim for it. Right. I just knew my guys weren't crazy, as we know crazy. They're character disorders, just, in layman's terms, just people that can't get along with anybody,
Right.
So people started coming together. We kept going to the APAs, and we kept presenting this delayed stress. From 78, 79, 80, by the time that the diagnostic group, the people that decide what goes into the psychiatric textbook, finally came up with the name, which today everybody knows, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Right. And it's been revised several times since, and that's really sort of the origin of it. And it's been a great thing. Doesn't mean that it didn't exist. The definition, defining it in a psychiatric textbook, was not available to them.
Right. Bridget, what was your introduction to PTSD?
Well, I grew up in a household with a father who was a World War II Korean War combat veteran. So I knew early on as a child that things were quite challenging in my household. And then when I was in graduate school in the 90s, I did a practicum at the Palo Alto VA. And I was in a program that lost its funding, and I saw how devastating that was to the veterans who were participating in that program. And so that spurred me to change my dissertation topic and do my dissertation on Vietnam veterans and social support and PTSD. And so ever since then, my whole life has just been working with veterans and their families since the 90s.
Great. World War II. We produced more combat veterans coming out of any war in World War II. Many of them have passed on. Some are in their 80s today, in their 90s. Where are they on the charts?
Well, actually, they're not on the charts. They could be on the charts.
Yeah.
They definitely are eligible to apply for PTSD. But I think a lot of things. But obviously, if I was a World War II vet, and the fact that all this developed out of the Vietnam era, and the fact that most of my life, major part of my life, is past, and wherever I am going back or saying, hey, I had this or whatever, or shell shock or whatever you want to call it, it's not going to make a real difference unless something happens where this person gets isolated and starts deteriorating, and all of a sudden he gets into the VA system. And when he opens up, like they did, if you remember, when Saving Private Ryan, remember the foundation got funding from DreamWorks because they were worried about these World War II vets seeing this real film, and sure enough, our hotline went from all Vietnam vets to about 3 months of nothing but World War II vets calling, going, I have that,
Yeah.
I felt that.
Yeah.
All of a sudden it was like, I didn't know this, and they just were a very silent, strong group generation. And we saw it very clearly that it definitely existed. It was like, whoa.
I remember that.
So historically, World War II vets just have lived and endured, and what you don't know won't hurt you. So now they know, and it's like, golly,
Yeah.
that would have been a lot easier if I could have went to a vet center or a workshop or whatever. Maybe I wouldn't have been married 3 times or suffered alcoholism or smoked myself to death or so forth.
We're going to take a break, and we will be right back with C4 on PTSD.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks a lot for all you guys have done.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you!
Thank you.
We are back. C4. I'm Rick Seaman here with my guest, Shad Meshad and Dr. Bridget Cantrell. I've closed my top button. We got a few calls during the break. Said I was showing too much. So forgive me for that. And now I feel very decent. Okay. So I've heard, and I know a lot of people I think have heard, this term full-blown PTSD. You're grinning, and I know, is that term valid? And if it is valid, does that mean there are various levels of actual PTSD? What's full-blown?
Well, full-blown is just a figure of speech. It's not a clinical term or whatever. It's a figure of speech. It's like saying we've shot this scene 1,000,000 times. I've been here 1,000,000 times. Mm-hmm. It's just a way of stating and emphasizing the fact that, in this case, this person definitely has PTSD. There's no questions. It's full-blown. It's obvious, whatever. It's strictly a figure of speech.
So does that mean that if you have it, you have it, and are there different levels to it?
Well, there's different severities of symptoms
There
associated
is.
with it, but if you have PTSD, you can have delayed onset or acute PTSD depending on the situation. But certainly, if you have the symptoms, it's something to look into further. And sometimes the symptoms will exacerbate; they'll get worse over time. And and that's the time that you know that things are falling apart and you need to get the help that you require to
Right.
deal with that.
Dr. Cantrell, a lot of your work is with the actual military before these young folks are discharged and become veterans. You're on a tour right now that's going to different bases, and what's the biggest thing you find as far as we're talking about these levels?
Yeah.
Are there other psychological disorders other than PTSD that would fall between PTSD and, let's say, being okay or normal? Are there other levels, and what are they?
Well, certainly there's symptoms associated with different diagnoses such as depression and anxiety, and of course there's sleep problems, and then there's issues just not being able to deal with people with anger, not getting along with people, poor impulse control, and those types of things, and drug and alcohol abuse.
Right.
Those are all parts of trying to deal with some of the issues associated with PTSD. And I know that I do work with the military as they get ready to deploy after deployment, but I also work with veterans and who have been in the military and have been out for many years. And so many of these things are so common across the eras.
Right. I know, Shad, I've actually witnessed some of your anger management sessions that you do. Now, if it's anger, can it be anger that a person needs some therapy and anger management, but he doesn't necessarily have PTSD? Does that exist? Or
Sure it does. I mean, you know, the PTSD is just one diagnosis. When you're dealing with war victims, it's the first thing to check out. Obviously, it's, you know, war is trauma. I mean, it's about killing and maiming and all these other horrific things. So it's the first thing that you want to check out. And many of the symptoms that are in PTSD, if they're isolated, like if a person just has an anger problem but doesn't have a depression problem, doesn't have flashbacks or this or that, then obviously it's not PTSD. You know, if a clinician is certified and understands PTSD and also understands all the other diagnoses, he'll be able or she'll be able to sort that out. Right. And there are different degrees of it. There's different degrees of PTSD. You know, there's mild. There's all these different ranges, depending on the number of symptoms manifested and the severity of some of the symptoms. When you start getting into anger and then over into depression, then we're looking at a real serious case of PTSD. If you're looking at generically soldiers that come back in life and death situations that have sort of a mild form of PTSD, many of them will transition that, even without help, as we've seen in other wars. In the study that we did in the Vet Center program the first 10 years, our $10 million study, 60% of those, and you're probably one of those, came back and moved on with their life without any treatment. Saw the same thing that the other 40% did, but that 40%, which is a high percentage, came back and had readjustment problems. Most of it manifested through some level of post-traumatic stress disorder.
a key word I heard you mention, it was readjustment. I just come home. I was in Iraq. I've been in a hot zone, right? Just 2 months ago. I think I can relate to this coming back from Vietnam. One of the first things you notice is your friends, your family who have not been in the military, they go about their daily lives and they want to whine about this and they want to cry about this, these little petty things, and it makes an ex-military guy a little crazy. Because the first thing he wants to say is, what in the hell is wrong with you? I wish you were where I just was for the last year.
I mean, that's normal generally.
Yeah.
It's the time after, how it continues and how their behavior manifests with it. That's just very normal. The person is going through, and 6 months of that, we all went through that. I know I did. I'm sure you did. You look at everything so different. And it's a matter of when, you know, if you're not a classic PTSD, you're eventually going to get it and somehow make the compromises that we all have to do every day, and you're going to eventually move on with your life. But there is a readjustment period.
And so to our veterans returning, they need to be aware of that, right?
Absolutely. It's a big problem, and it puts a lot of stress on the families, and it scares the wives. Oftentimes, and then even their peers, they can't even relate to their peers that they left behind because they have grown up so much and become a person that they can no longer relate to these kids at home. They're still stuck in 18 years old. These young men and women who come home their eyes have seen far too much, and their maturity level is way beyond their chronological age. So it's very difficult for them to relate to their peers. It's very difficult for them to relate to their families. They're not the little boy or little girl that mom and dad sent over to Iraq before they went over.
Exactly. And above, or maybe we should say below, what you're doing by going onto these bases and running these counseling programs, do you think the military is doing a good job of what you just mentioned, giving them some idea of what they're going to have to look for in themselves for smooth readjustment?
I think they're trying to, well, I don't like that word try. I think they are doing something to the best of their abilities, but I think that it's really falling short in a lot of areas, unfortunately, because the demands are so great. It's not that the military isn't doing what they can, it's just the demands are outweighing what services are available. I know that different programs are associated with different military branches. And I was just at a Marine conference, and they had people there from their stress teams who are actually, they go in with the Marines in basic training, and they go throughout their whole process with them, so they have a very good bond built with these care providers. So it's not like they're going to the white coats at the VA all of a sudden and trying to tell their stories and try to open themselves up and not know the person that they're talking to. And so I know various branches are doing certain things, but I think the demands are so great now. And then of course associated with that is the stigma associated with getting help. And those stigmas run deep, and they've gone on from the beginning of time, even the Vietnam vets. And I always am so grateful to the Vietnam veterans for standing up and having a voice, because it's you here that have allowed the subsequent warriors to come forward and admit, you know, there's nothing to be ashamed of. We need help when we need help. And, you know, there's studies that have shown that with the proper treatment and early interventions, the symptoms will go down in duration and severity. So it's very positive to seek help.
I have a little different perspective on the first part about what the military is doing. It's very inadequate what they're trying to do, and it's not because they're doing sort of a half job or whatever. It's just military is trained. The mission of the military is to search and destroy the enemy. All of your training is built and based around becoming a killing machine. However you've got to do it. We just need to cut to the chase and stop talking. It's very hard for them to switch around and say, all right, now we're going to bring in social worker or Bridget or me or whatever in and talk about how you detune that. They don't really want that detuned. That's why they recruit high school graduates primarily with that high testosterone. They're not sophisticated. They don't think very much. They're reactive. They want to teach them to be reaction machines. So it's very difficult to set up kind of a program. So it's just politically correct to say, yeah, we have this program, we bring in the social workers, they can bring us in or whatever, but soon as that person leaves, they're back on there, and this is the mission. And that's really what they do well. They don't do this touchy-feely stuff well, and I think it's ridiculous. They need to make sure that when they're discharged or come out, that they go somewhere else, not in the military, and whether it's, you know, a special program where they come in and help deprogram and make it mandatory for everybody away from the military, away with their own. So
this is very important. I think we should talk some more about it. We're going to take a break, and we will be right back. Stay tuned.
Incheon, Da Nang, Desert Storm, Baghdad. I stare at photos like these and I think about the men and women who never made it back and wonder why I did. Some vets wonder who was luckier. If you have days like that and they turn into weeks and months, there's something you need to do before they turn into years or worse. Call the National Veterans Foundation. There's always a vet by the phone to advise you on VA issues, help out with drug and alcohol problems, or just listen and really understand. I'm Dan Lauria. I was proud to serve my country during Vietnam, and now I'm proud to serve the National Veterans Foundation. We've been around for over 20 years. Since wars don't seem to be going away anytime soon, neither will we. You can count on it.
We are back, C4. During the break, we talked a little bit, and I want to bring this back up with what Bridget was saying about talking to troops before they discharge and how important that is. Vietnam versus Iraq. Vietnam, most of the combat infantry troops were drafted. They did their tour in Vietnam. If they made it 12 months, most didn't, but if they did, they left right from Vietnam, and within a week or 2 weeks, they were back in society, coming right out of a hot zone. I know in my case, I was fortunate. I got wounded in Vietnam after 7 months there. I went to the hospital 2 months, and then I had some time left before my early out could occur, and I spent 4 months in Korea. And I got to tell you, I think that was a great thing for me because it was a buffer. It was a cool down. I was still in the military, but I got to do some fun things while I was there. I didn't have to be a grunt. I got to work in a supply house, and it was great. And what do we know? What the forecast is? What is PTSD going to cost this country, say, in the next 30, 40 years? Do we know?
I think we do. I think we do. I think I do. I have a new research analyst that looked at the numbers given to what the reports are coming out of DOD and VA, and it was close to $800 billion if we were to, diagnose correctly and reimburse all of these soldiers for the rest of their lives.
And that's
now today's dollar rate, around $800 billion.
And that's going to downrange 30, 40 years, correct?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. All right. This war isn't going to last 30, 40 years. There may be other wars, but for right now, this war in Iraq isn't going to last 30, 40 years.
No.
Okay. Instead of spending $800 billion, what if the military created a Korea for these folks coming out of Iraq, a cool down zone, not really an R&R, but you're still on active duty, but you perform duties on a base somewhere, but there's also folks like Dr. Cantrell there, folks like yourself, but they're still in a working environment. It's not like you're being sent to the hospital. It's cool down. You can have activities, you can have recreation at night.
We've already had that. Don't you realize that in World War II, when the troops came back from the Pacific and from the Atlantic, they came back on troop-carrying ships. And it was a full month.
Playing poker.
Yes. Talking with their own colleagues, people that were familiar with the experience, dreaming, having a chance to reflect, and not be just foxhole the front porch in 36 hours like it was for Vietnam vets.
Well,
and probably today.
Might that have something to do with what we talked about earlier on the show about how come we haven't heard from all these World War II vets?
Could be that. Could be, absolutely.
Is that possible?
I think so. They had people to witness their experiences and validate what they were feeling. I mean, they cried together, they laughed together. I mean, they actually just debriefed together for a whole month at sea.
And society embraced them when they came back.
Yeah.
Where particularly in our war, and it's getting somewhat that way now with the Iraq vets and Afghanistan vets. We remember when we came back, we were pulling our uniforms off in the bathroom and hiding and putting wigs on or whatever, trying to look like we weren't a soldier because we were fighting the war in Vietnam and we had to fight the war coming back because we were scapegoated. They confused the warrior with the war.
Right.
In this war, look at the first year, 2 years, and every vet came through the airport or whatever, everybody, they'd be in their uniforms, everybody was clapping or whatever. I fly all the time. That's over. That was like putting the flags up after 9/11. Everybody had a flag or a sticker on their car. Once those things wore out, nobody stuck them back up. It was a fad. And now you sit there and you see the troops isolated. People walk by them, you see them sitting up against the wall. It kind of it's a little eerie. It's not as bad. People aren't cursing and spitting on them like they were us, but they're in their jungle fatigues, and people just walk by like, you know, it's like this TV show, you know, it's been playing long enough. You know, can we change the channel? Can we see a different movie? So I think absolutely the major thing is for the individual. The deprogramming, the timeout zone, to me is worth $1 trillion.
Right.
Save us a lot of money.
It would save us a lot of money. How do we implement it? How do you get this idea started? What do we do?
Well,
The thing is that there's different objectives. The military has different objectives, the government has different objectives, and it all comes down to funding. I get contacted all the time because I'm a nonprofit organization to see what I can do to help, but I'm only one person. And I get from the soldiers themselves that I work with, and I'm just saying soldiers as a generic term, all branches who have served in Iraq, they say, you know, put me on a desert island somewhere with for 2 weeks with all of the pleasures I can imagine, and just let me debrief and let me be with my guys.
Yeah.
You know, bring people in that know what they're talking about, that can relate to their experience, and allow them just to be where they are for, you know, a couple of months, however long it takes, because it's very difficult for them to come home, as you know, and get right back in the saddle again and think of, I've got to go back to my jobs, I've got to be a husband again, I've got to be a father again, I have to be responsible, I have to go back into being a citizen again, and it's very, very difficult.
If I was a senator and I was sitting here listening to this, and alongside me was someone from the Appropriations Committee of the Senate, I'd sit here and go, hey, that's a great idea. So what can we do? I mean, you've heard it first right here. And I guess what we're saying is, remember the old Fram oil filter commercial?
oh gosh, my favorite.
The guy held up the filter, and he's scolding you because you haven't changed your oil filter, and he says, you can pay me now or you can pay me later, meaning you can spend $3 right now for this oil filter, or later you can spend $2,500 for a new motor. That's kind of what...
That says it all. That's exactly what we're talking about. But back to your question, if you were senator and I was on the Appropriations Committee, the first thing, because I've been there before when we were doing the vet centers back in the late 70s.
Right.
And every year, 80, 81, 82, 83, you know, up until the time I left. And the key thing is show me budget analysis. Well, we've already done in my office a look at what it would cost just for the individual to reimburse them, say, for PTSD.
And that's
it was
frightening.
close to $800 billion for a lifetime.
And that's frightening, and that should be frightening to every taxpayer in this country.
The second is you've got to present a budget to show what it would cost to implement this stand-down 30-day, 60-day program or deprogramming
Right.
from soldier to civilian, what that would cost.
During wartime.
And I guarantee
period.
you it's going to be microscopic next to that big number. But you've got to show that. So that would be the next step. Then they would probably have a hearing, and they would need someone to present and lay out a budget. This is what it's going to cost if you had to do this, and this is what it's going to cost if you set up this transitional period for these soldiers.
Vets, tell your congressman, tell them to watch this show, C4 number 6. C4 number 6. Tell them to get online, watch this show, listen to my man Shad, listen to Dr. Bridget Cantrell here. But anyway, this is C4, and we're going to be back with part 2 on PTSD. This is not over yet by any means, and we'll talk to you soon. Rick Seaman, out.